Well, this is the second talk in the Big Ideas in Little Pictures series, and this one's going to concentrate on the unique human faculty of synthesis, which you could call all-in-one thinking. Now, the big idea in this particular talk that we're addressing, Gregory's big idea, is that God created all humanity in one man. So, what David maintained was that Gregory says, in saying that God created Adam, Scripture implies not that God created an individual at a point in time who then became the progenitor of all humanity, but rather that God created all humanity as an integrated whole in one act of creation. And that therefore God will, this is very significant, recreate all humanity as an integrated whole in the new creation. Specifically what David said, and he mentioned it in his talk on Gregory's great book, co-authored with Macrina, on the soul and the resurrection. This is what he said: from the perspective of eternity, true creation is true humanity in the divine image, perfected in divine likeness and union with God. And this is the quote-unquote man of the first creation account in Genesis 1:27. This is all human beings throughout all time united in spiritual harmony in their rational nature with Christ as their head, deified in God. This is the true creation. Now, Gregory himself develops this theme extensively on the making of man. Here's an example from chapter 16. What is it then which we understand concerning these matters? In saying that God created man, the text indicates, by the indefinite character of the term, the text indicates all mankind. The name given to the man created is not a particular name, but the general name. Thus we are led to some such view as this: that in the divine foreknowledge and power, all humanity is included in the first creation. Well, I think straight away we can see this is challenging. And there are two ways we can see it's challenging. Firstly, it's just conceptually difficult. It seems to defy logic. How can God create one man and at the same time create millions or billions of individuals who flow from the one man? Secondly, it's theologically challenging because it seems to challenge the individual view of what becomes sin and accountability. So let's begin by looking at what I would call what most of us have in our mental landscape as the normal concept of creation. And I think normally we conceive both creation and reality as individualistic. So in other words, God created one individual, be that literally or metaphorically, and this individual procreated, and that led to the multiplicity of humans on the earth. That is, one individual from whom many flow. So we can call that the individualistic picture of the universe of humanity. And then, of course, this individual sinned, and the consequences of that sin flowed to everyone. Well, it seems common sense, but there are problems with this view. And firstly, there are theological problems. It leads us to an individualistic picture of reality and hence of salvation. From a salvation point of view, it leads to the case by case perspective of salvation. That is, God treats everybody as an individual based on their merits and on their faith. And we've probably got some kind of framework like that, most of us, at the back of our minds, because it's common sense. Well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that idea of both individual ontology and individual accountability? Well, I think primarily it shrinks the scope of salvation. It shrinks the scope to the salvation of many individual souls. There isn't a bigger object of salvation. There's no cosmic scale implied, no community scale, either to salvation or the interests of God. insofar as there is any kind of communal scale, it's the accumulated destiny of many individuals. And in turn, if you push it further, I think what this leads to is a shrunken view of God, which I think we all probably have. And when I say all, I'm not talking about Christians, I'm talking about most people, i.e. big, not eternal. That's how I'd put it. So he and his judgments are, by this kind of mental model, they're atomised or fragmented. In essence, we've reduced the concept of infinite to meaning very, very big. So God can handle these billions of individual cases on account of he's very big. But if you think about it, this is just making God an expansion of single individuals, and it's tending to reduce infinity and the divine to a multiplication of individuality and fragments. We're almost implying our mortality, we can only handle a few units, but God can handle an infinite number of units. And it's actually, if you think about it, it's making God just a bigger version of ourselves. And remember, the perspective that David was ascribing to Gregory is that Gregory was trying to view creation ex nihilo from an eternal perspective, not from a common sense human perspective. Well, how are we to understand or get a glimpse of an eternal perspective? How can we view the creation of the world, which does imply a world framed in space and time, from the perspective of a creator who's outside space and time and even existence itself? Now, for that, we, strange as it might seem and impossible as it might seem, we can turn to our own experience of mind, and in this particular case, the mysterious faculty of synthesis. So, let's explore this. Now, in my first video, I critiqued problem solving as a framework for critical thinking. I said that was limited. And now this time I'll critique its wicked sister, which is reductionism. And most analytic toolkits do operate under a principle of reductionism. So reductionism in problem solving takes a unified thing, big thing, and it breaks it down into components. For instance, in the great famous strategy firm McKinsey's problem-solving approach, the first thing you're told to do is take a big problem and break it down into bite-sized chunks. Now, obviously, this has got some wisdom in it, but it does lead quickly to a rather more major issue, which is once I have broken something down into component bits, am I still looking at the same problem or the same system? If you look at the world of organisational consulting, you will have come on management. You'll come across what's called driver trees, and what that happens is breaking an organisation down into increasingly detailed componentry. Here's an example of one. This is around a so-called profit driver tree, and you can see you first of all break profits down to one layer of revenues, cost of sales, operating costs, borrowing costs, and taxes, and then you keep going. You break revenues down to revenue per customer and the number of customers. You break cost of sales down into volumes, etc., etc., and you just keep on decomposing. And you can see the further you go across, the more components there'll be, and you've probably got a question, well, where would I stop anyway? At what level would I stop? But it does look remorselessly logical. And you could say, well, what's wrong with that? This is just being logical. Well, let me tell you two big weaknesses with this reductionist model. Firstly, it doesn't help creative thinking. This fragmented way of looking at an organisation or any system actually is only useful if the system already exists and you're trying some kind of diagnosis of it. It doesn't help you create an organisation from nothing. If you think, well, driver trees are the ultimate picture of reality, the perfect picture of reality, well, you could assume all we need to do is create all these component parts and work on each of them, and they'll add up magically to an organisation. By the way, there was a great book years ago called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance that critiques this. But the point is that, practically speaking, no entrepreneur, and I am an entrepreneur and I work with entrepreneurs, has ever created an organisation that way. Now, the most profitable organisation on the planet today is Apple. Did you think Steve Jobs looked at a big driver tree and said, I'm going to create that, and that's how I'll create this new organisation? Well, there's no way. And the second weakness is just as profound. It assumes that the whole is made up of the sum of the parts. And the whole essence of systems thinking, if you're familiar with it, is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But if you believe the whole is just the sum of the parts, it will lead you to an atomist view of reality. Reality is just bits and pieces, tons of bits and pieces. And it implies the real building blocks of reality are the smallest elements that can be broken. They can't be broken down any further. So this kind of reductionist view, whilst at face value looks like it's accurate, this view of reality doesn't help with creativity, and nor does it even present an accurate picture, certainly of reality as a whole rather than as parts. And reductionism does not give us insight cognitively into the experience of mind that we all participate in creative thinking. So how can we do this? How can we kind of peer into this synthesis? Because synthesis is always cited as one of the major cognitive capacities of creativity. And as I've said before, one of the problems with our education system all the way through is that it's much stronger on analytic tools than it is on creative tools. So, synthesis, the seed of creativity. We have a unique aspect of mind that contrasts with reductionism, and we call this synthesis. It works in the opposite way to analytic reductionism. What synthesis does is it integrates things into wholes rather than breaking them down into parts. And this cognitive capacity of ours really defies any easy explanation. You can't codify it into discrete steps, 1, 2, and 3. It seems to be an all-at-once capacity we've got. In particular, it's not the same as adding together. It's not the same as accumulating all the parts and saying, now I've got the whole. So I can't take multiple units and add them together and get the whole that binds them. It doesn't work that way. Here's a simple example. So here are 12 dots. They're units. Each dot's a unit. And you can add those up and they will come to 12 units. However, if I arrange them differently, these dots, we'll have two very different pictures of reality. So now we have a property that's holistic. It's one thing. One of them is a cross. And here's this other one. It's a tree. This is synthesis at work. Straight away you can see possibly the main point about how synthesis works and what it achieves. It begins in the mind of the creator. It's not a mere description of the qualities of the material it works on. The cross and the tree are images, ideas in the mind of the creator. Me, in this case. They're not intrinsic qualities of the dots. And then this image in the mind of the creator governs the creation and arrangement of the dots. It shapes reality and it gives the dots their meaning. So now we are beginning to get closer to Gregory's idea. Perhaps this is exactly how the mind of God worked in creating mankind. Rather than create quote unquote lots of dots, he began with an image, much like my cross or tree, and he created that image first. And we would say, if we pushed it, this was the image of the Logos. This was actually the divine image. And the dots don't make any sense unless they are integrated into that image. So in a sense, the dots don't have an independent reality. They are there to form the image. The image comes first. The dots obey it. Well, let me tell you a story about how this works in practice, in the way that we human beings design systems. A few years ago, my firm had an assignment with a major minerals company exporting vast quantities of iron ore overseas to China. A major part of that operation was shipping. And in fact, they had the largest port in Australia and the largest ships that entered Australian waters. Now, they didn't own these ships. They came from a myriad of companies around the world. So the logistics of organising this supply chain was immense. And it was not just a matter of computerising timetables, because this shipping system was working in the rail politic of the dark world of international shipping. Ships owned by Greek billionaires or Swedish princes, ships from all around the globe, and they all came under different flags and jurisdictions. Now, the general manager of shipping, a wonderful man called George, very creative, idiosyncratic German, wanted to radically improve what he thought was an ad hoc system. He wanted to bring more rigour and consistency to it, and particularly wanted to make it resilient to staff changes, because the old guard were retiring and new people needed to come in. So they tried to improve it themselves, and they'd followed a normal process, a process of what's called process mapping. So here's an example of one of these process maps. And you can see it's very, very fine-tuned. There were pages and pages of it, little steps. It typifies reductionist thinking, not in a driver tree, but a process map. And they thought, this is reality. We're capturing the details of reality, and the process map. The closer we get to behaviours and steps, the better. It was a bit like the 12 dots view of reality. But they weren't getting anywhere, according to George, with this approach. It didn't help them innovate and think differently about the system. All the process map would let you do is rationalise the system. Let's take out 3 steps or do something like that. Whereas he wanted a paradigm shift that could open up new possibilities. So we worked with them, and as we mulled over it, we created an image of the system. And here's the image. We call it the flying wedge. It was, in fact, we reconceptualized the image as a single thing, a year-long conversation. And the icon for that, which is a dialectical process, is this schematic of what we call the flying wedge. And we captured it on one page. It says, here's one page, this is the image, and you see that graphically it hits you as a whole. It's a whole thing. The first thing you see are these converging lines. It has one unifying concept. There are parts to it, but the whole governs the parts. The second thing about this approach, which they found quite a breakthrough in their thinking, was that this whole picture gave meaning to all the parts. That is, to all the individual steps and activities. They fit inside this picture. The whole allowed them, therefore, to interpret the parts, see how they relate to each other, how they contribute to each other, layers of work. It sort of arranged the energies and dynamics of the system, not as a set of rat-a-tat goose steps, but as converging tensions between ships and the delivery plan. And the third thing to notice in this one image is that the meaning climaxes with the purpose of the system, or its outcome, which is the right-hand side, which is ships matched to cargoes. So all the events were moving to a common end, a common outcome. And what this let us do with them, is to begin to reshape the system from its purpose, not from its steps. Now, cognitively, what was happening in the synthesis process was that it was something originated in our minds, in our imagination, as it was an idea, and that new idea would now shape a new reality. The idea did not come from an inductive summary of the steps. It came from the purpose of the system. It was, as it were, an ideal idea. So in improving or recreating the system, we could then work backwards from that image to create a new reality rather than just adjusting current reality. Well, I hope you can see how we're following divine footsteps here. I just used to go through these projects and think, oh dear me, we're walking on holy ground. What we're saying here is this, that our minds walk in divine footsteps when we synthesize. We can empathize with the divine or the eternal mind when we see a big picture that unites a multitude of details into one reality. The reality begins with the big picture, not with the details. So now we can listen to Gregory's claim that the divine mind, in conceiving how the universe would be governed by human agents, created one man, one big picture that united all mankind into one patterned, integrated and purposeful whole. He did not create multitudinous individuals and then start to judge them one by tedious one. His purpose was to create a human-centered universe, and to that end he created, quote, one man, which became in the New Testament one new man to govern the universe. That one man was certainly one governing idea, but more than that, it was the Logos, the Son, who would integrate all humanity in himself, just as we can have one governing idea that can encompass all details into one meaningful whole. So, let's conclude where we started. Gregory's counterintuitive claim that God created all humanity in one man. This claim, of course, extends into the New Testament. I mean, his idea of oneness as the goal of God's project was very much picked up in Ephesians 1 verse 10, which claims that the purpose of God is to summarize or integrate or recapitulate all things in Christ. And at face value, as we said, this kind of all-in-one faculty seems counterintuitive, but we found a deeper reflection is that actually our experience of mind does just the same thing through this faculty we call synthesis. And that this faculty comes into play when we human beings create new things. Of course, our creation is much more limited than God's, I understand that, but nonetheless, in terms of the quality of thinking, we've got a fractal of the mind of God. It's mysterious and hard to formulate, but it's extremely real because we do it all the time. It's just hard to describe. And what I say is this tells us a lot about ourselves, a lot about God, and a lot about his ways of working. We will get a lot closer to understanding God by attributing synthesis to him, not bigness. And we'll get a lot closer to understanding our role in creation as we see it as a role of joining God's work of creating oneness in a fragmented world. Well, much more I could say about this. I will say that this message, all these messages, do give us Christians a new message for the world. Not just you're a sinner, but rather you're made in the image of God. You're much closer to God than you think you are. Let me explain why. This claim is in a contest of ideas. Today, in the postmodern world, the artificial intelligence world, the secular age, a claim like that, as wonderful as it is still in contest with the prevailing anthropology that tends to devalue humans and claims to explain mind merely as a biological construct. So it is against the world, as Athanasius said of himself, but in a new context. Not saying you're sinners and implying we're not, but rather we have a divine view of humanity. That's the Judeo-Christian tradition. Our problem as humans is we don't recognise that divine touch. It's clouded, it's obscured by modern fables and deceits. And this gives us a wonderful new starting point to talk about the incarnation and the very nature of salvation.
We hope you enjoyed this piece by Gospel Conversations. For more information, please head to www.gospelconversations.com. Thank you and God bless.